This is Discourse, a production of the Religious Studies podcast. Every month we come to you and discuss religion in the current news. My name is Dan Gorman. I'm a PhD student at the University of Rochester in the United States, and I'm joined today by Sidney and Maxine. And Maxine, would you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Maxinne Connolly-Panagopoulos, and I am doing podcasts with the Religious Studies Project, and I've just finished my PhD in psychology of religion, where I focused on religious conversion among Iranian migrants in Scotland.
And Sidney?
Thank you for this chance to talk with you. I'm Sidney Castillo. I'm a first-year PhD candidate in social and cultural anthropology at the University of Helsinki. And my thesis topic was about ayahuasca rituals and ethical self-making among indigenous peoples of Peru. But I have very, very deep interest in religious studies. I've been collaborating with the RSP for some years now. Some podcasts there, contributions, and I just like to talk about religion. So it's a wonderful chance to keep on the conversation.
And the nice thing is we can do this without leaving our houses.
That's so nice.
So we've got a couple articles to talk about today. The first one, well, not just one article, but the first topic, Lil Nas X, the country rapper who's taken the United States and the internet by storm with his provocative new video, Montero, Call Me By Your Name, which features him, among other things, dealing with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, harrowing into hell, giving Satan a lap dance, and killing Satan. Any opening thoughts on this?
It's really a fun video, if I have to say. I mean, just to get that out of the way, it's a really fun video. I had fun watching it. I mean, it's a whole journey, I would say.
It's a good song as well. In preparing for this and reading some of the articles, I've just been walking around all week going, call me by your... it is really catchy. I think what's really interesting about it, though, even as you were saying there, Sidney, it's really high. It's really attractive to watch, and it's really high budget. And I think you need to mention as well the shoes that came shortly after the video. So during Holy Week, Nas released these sort of Satan shoes that had reference to Luke 10:18, I believe, which kind of spoke about a fallen angel. And the major controversy around this as well was that the shoes were supposedly created with a drop of blood in each of them, and there were only 666 of them released, and I think they sold out within a minute, and the internet went quite mad with that. And I think it's really interesting because the company had also released holy shoes, I think a couple months prior, where it had the kind of angelic theme, and the idea was that in the bottom of the shoe there was a drop of holy water, and there wasn't really any, no one really protested this. There wasn't, which I think is interesting because you could argue that that's sort of blasphemy as well, the sort of like commercialization of holy water and things like that, but no one really seemed to bat an eyelid. But when it was tied to Lil Nas, his video, the content of it, there was a huge uproar. And I think that's among one of the really interesting parts of this.
Yeah, I was thinking also the most interesting commentary I read about this was an article by the religion scholar Heather White for NBC, in which she argued that evangelicals getting angry at this content, seeing it as blasphemous, was the point, and how Lil Nas X, real name Montero Hill, is trying to give them some sense of the outrage he's felt at the church his whole life, feeling alienated from it as a gay man. And White also cites another theologian, Alicia Crosby, who points out that the video depicts Lil Nas X descending into hell, killing Satan, and taking his place. He has wings and looks like a dark angel at the end, but he's playing with the iconography of Jesus conquering death. I'm still not quite sure what I think the symbolism is of him appearing as an angel with black wings as opposed to white wings.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing I read in The Guardian as well about this idea of weaponizing his shame. And I think you really touched on that about, him saying, like, if you're angry, good, because I felt like this as well. And I think, rather than, I don't believe like his intention is to offend necessarily. And even if it is, like, we'll talk about this a bit later, but, obviously he has every right to, but I think it is more about him kind of owning the shame that he's felt and sort of weaponizing it, which I think is a really interesting take on it. And the some of the response to it has been wild. I saw a governor, I think Christy Noem, had actually tweeted saying that people need to guard their eternal souls against this, that this is a national outcry again, a fight against the souls of young people. And a lot of folk were speaking about, a lot of articles were talking about how this was so similar to the Satanic panic of the 1980s. But of course, you can't ignore the fact, as you said, like Lil Nas is a queer Black man, and that seems to really ruffle feathers more as well.
Most definitely, I agree with that. I think one of the greater messages of the whole song and the video as well is like him coming together with his own, like the rejection he faced throughout his life of like his own sexuality and his perceived masculinity. But one thing that struck me was that it is always like often thought that hip hop is like such a male or like traditionally entrenched gender roles or kind of sexualities like are like deeply rooted in hip hop music. So like men have to be not only any kind of man, but the man and woman also in that sense. So it's kind of like this kind of song and media or video is kind of subverting all of that in a way that is also very clever because it's a very good marketing tactic. I mean, partially that's what also the metalheads in the 1980s or 1990s did with their own music. Just like controversy sells, so why not get a share of that cake? With their like putting of the label of the like what was the name of the organization, PMRC, and the rating system that came with along with the parental advisory tag, which is like free publicity for all the like kind of metal bands or any kind of musician artist that start like touching upon lyrical themes that could seem of offending or like or hurting susceptibility. So I think it's quite a nice way to win, like hit a bird with two birds with one stone.
This is not in any way an academic concept, but my father has this thing he calls the stickiness factor that he sees in marketing. If it sticks in your head, then it's good for business. And by those criteria, Lil Nas has succeeded admirably. The last thing I wanted to ask about you both about this before we move on is we've seen a trend of queer men, not just in hip hop, but basically in pop music, being much more open about their beliefs. What do we think about his choice to be vulnerable like that, and not just vulnerable, to really embrace his sexuality this publicly, compared to past musicians who've tried to be more, I don't want to say covert, but they haven't tried to draw as much attention to it?
I think it's a zeitgeist thing as well, not taking away from his bravery, exactly as Sidney was saying. Hip hop is so hyper masculine and has been for such a long time. I mean, I don't even know if it's right to say this, but people thinking like, oh, actually Dr. Dre is gay and he's been hiding it for so many years and things like that. And you imagine how this would have been received not only by like the religious community in the 90s, 80s, but by the hip hop community as well. And I think it's really positive that the zeitgeist has shifted so much that this is actually not just seen as something that is solely a publicity stunt and completely subversive, but it is actually a sense of empowerment, and that he is being celebrated for this as well. I think it's really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how this shifts the culture as well. Because in the Old Town Road music video, I think at that point he hadn't officially come out yet. And it's interesting that, he's kind of chosen to tell it this way and to be so vulnerable. It's really admirable, and I think it's being well received.
Most definitely, I think it's groundbreaking as well because of the genre that he is involved in. But also we can draw some kind of parallelisms in metal. For example, Rob Halford, like long-time vocalist of Judas Priest, he was like came up gay, or he came out in the 90s, and it was thought that he was going to face a lot of backlash, but because also metal was thought of a kind of a community that is hyper masculinized. You could see like many album covers from the 80s and early 90s that are like trying to touch upon that kind of aesthetic. But at the end, I mean, he's just one more musician, and he was like, everyone is supportive of him because it really, it's just part of being a person, It's also like somehow feeds on your artistic imaginary and also what you do as an artist and your output. So I think it's a great thing to kind of move having the conversation in the first place within that specific genre, because I think it would just move forward in that.
Sidney, you
that
wanted to
side.
talk further about religion and heavy metal. I almost said religion and hip hop, wrong H. But yeah, religion and heavy metal. You sent an article by Michael Hahn from The Guardian called Nurgle, the extreme metal musician fighting Poland's blasphemy laws. Tell us about Nurgle, if I'm saying that right.
Yes, well, yeah, Nergal, see. Adam Nergal Darski is his full name. Well, actually, Nergal is his artistic name. He's a what do you say this? Frontman of a black metal band called Behemoth from Poland. And they have been like releasing black metal music since like 2000s, even before. It's quite good music, if I have to say. And on that side, I'm wearing a black metal T-shirt as well, Mayhem, which is a Norwegian band, since it's fitting because of the topic of Satanism and stuff. But anyhow, yeah. So he has kind of a rock star status in Poland. I mean, he was a judge for the Voice Poland, for instance, and he appears in a series of like kind of reality shows, and he's quite active in social media as well. So he tends to have this kind of I don't know, because of his own probably personal beliefs or values or marketing or kind of some kind of positioning to his band, but he also tends to be a little bit not a little bit, quite controversial with how he performs on stage. So for instance, like I just like drawing lines with Marilyn Manson, for instance, like ripping a Bible on stage, or like before a concert, he also stepped on the Virgin Mary, which was one of the things that actually made him, the Polish state charge him with kind of, how to say, charges of blasphemy or like incite or hurting religious feelings. That was the phrase. But this is the latest case of a series of cases that started somehow in 2007 or 8 with this ripping of the Bible and saying like many bad things about the Catholic Church, which in that context I think are permissible. At the end, it's like artistic expression, freedom of expression as well. But this is how somehow the whole framing of this kind of campaign, Ordo Blasphemia, is cited. So it's because he wants to raise money pay for his like law, like how do you say, for the expenses with the like, because he has to assist to court and stuff. But also not only for that, but also like to set in a precedent for other artists that should or can face any kind of blasphemy charges to be able to have some funds to pay for their defense. So this is the whole situation over there, and I think yeah, it's like something you don't see every day, like blasphemy
It's really
laws.
interesting that, Sidney. I was reading that article, and I think he said that in the article there were only 4 people that had complained about the picture of him standing on and he had posted it on his own Instagram, a picture of a booth near the the Virgin Mary, and 4 people complained, and now he's being sort of prosecuted or attempted to be prosecuted on this, which is really, really interesting. And there's a part where there's one of the quotes where he says, in court, I'm really asking, is there a thermometer of religious beliefs? Because, the understanding of the counter argument to that, according to this article, is that they're saying, well, in Poland, we want to create a pluralistic society where people are allowed to have many religious beliefs, and those beliefs aren't stood upon as such. That's the sort of counter argument. But I love his quote about, well, what's the thermometer here? People are going into his private space, his Instagram, and essentially looking to exploit this sort of rising tide of blasphemy prosecutions in Poland. And I think that that's really dangerous.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, how the Catholic Church was illegal when Poland was a communist state. And now you have a government that's arguably fascist in power in Poland, becoming more powerful, and it's using Catholicism. It's almost like the belief doesn't matter. It's a tribal marker. It's saying, we're Poles, we're Catholics. You either align with us or you can get out.
Exactly.
I do find the silence of the Catholic Church on the way the religion's being weaponized to be rather disturbing. But I wonder if this is a case where you would find many Catholics, even if they criticize the Polish government, coming out against Nergal and saying, oh, he's being blasphemous, it's all right. What do we think about how we draw alliances with autocrats or not?
Most definitely. And I think this issue, specifically on that matter, has been polarizing people, like more or less like deterring people from supporting Catholicism or even belonging to Catholicism or voicing their belonging to Catholicism. So, for instance, like one of the waves or shifts in Polish religiosity is that young people are less likely to assert their beliefs in the Catholic Church or support the Catholic Church because of happenings like this or events like this. Also, not so long ago, the Polish government almost completely banned abortion in every cases, and this generated a lot of social uprising and protests. But also because somehow the Catholic institution in Poland is so deeply rooted with government at the same time, and they have been kind of covering up pedophilia cases in the Catholic Church. So all of these things are somehow playing against what the actually hierarchy or Catholic Church wants to do, which is assert a Polish identity or kind of make it uniform and make it resonant with also the state. So, but I think at the end it's backfiring massively.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you have these sort of identity lines that you don't cross. So in my work, as I was saying, I looked at Iranian migrants who were leaving Islam, and a lot of that had to do with a sort of rejection of the theocratic government. And it's almost like you're seeing the same thing in Poland, this kind of theocratic government as well. And it's interesting how people, I guess it's unfair to say, but I would assume logically that I would be more against someone who was being accused of pedophilia than someone who posted an Instagram photo of themselves stepping on a picture. But when you're in this sort of situation where your identity is so fixed with, the state, which endorses this certain religion, you can imagine that there'll be quite a lot of sort of dissonance there in terms of, well, I can't really actually stand out to that. So the illogical almost becomes the logical because it is protecting the security of our identities. And I think that's something that we're seeing in so many pockets around the world.
I've been thinking too about how these accusations of blasphemy tend to shut down conversation rather than further it. Earlier, Sidney, you mentioned the content warning labels that appeared on American records starting in the 1980s. And there were Democrats like Al Gore pushing those originally. It wasn't a purely left-right thing. I do find it interesting how across the political spectrum we'll wind up with these simplistic ideas of what is or is not licit, and then if you try to pick into that, people will just, if they're inclined to accuse things of being blasphemy, they get angry and don't want to think critically about it.
Exactly. Well, it's easier to get angry than to reason about it or like just talk with the people involved. It's always harder to just try to
Especially
hear
when
the
the
other
other people
parts, so.
involved are like wearing corpse paint and burning crosses and things like that. It is so and
yeah,
that's one of
definitely.
the things that I think is brilliant about black metal is how like theatrical it is and things like that. But to someone who, as we were saying, has that kind of identity, that's not a conversation you want to engage in. It's easier to see them as others or as so dangerous, than someone who dresses like you, looks like you, even as simple as listening to the same music.
I think that's a really key point, Maxine. Earlier, you mentioned the
Exactly.
satanic panic, but how social scientific studies have shown that in the case of child abuse, it's not the fear of the mysterious stranger coming in. It's someone someone close by. That's where the real threats are.
Mhm.
Speaking of threats, we have another,
So,
well, I suppose religious backlash is a theme of this episode, Christian backlash. But the next article we had is about evangelical American criticisms of yoga. So once again, this is The Guardian. Ed Pilkington reporting from New York about evangelicals in Alabama. Yoga can leave you injured, psychotic, and a Hindu, Christian groups claim. Now, Maxine, before this, you were tossing around an article by Stephen Prothero talking about Hindu phobia as well as Hinduphilia in the United States. Both have deep histories. Did you want to bring that up in regard to this topic?
Yeah, it was such a great article. So, I mean, first of all, the Guardian article was speaking a lot about actually this fear or the backlash against yoga is wanting to overturn a 28-year ban of yoga in public schools in Alabama, and that's what sort of sparked all of this off. But the Prothero article was so fascinating because it spoke a lot about the history within America. And I believe it was like the 1910s, 20s. There was a woman called Mrs. Bull. And she had gotten involved really actively in yoga and swamis and things like that. And when she died, she had wanted to leave all of her money to an organization. And her daughter actually took the case to court and basically made the argument that, the swamis had, I think they referred to it like they had tarnished her brain and they were a bacteria. And so like really, really strong language coming in. And, she ended up winning that case. And there were a few other cases mentioned where, people ended up in asylums and things like that because of, just the sensationalized attitudes towards Eastern religious practices. So it went from yoga to, well, actually yoga is a gateway drug for tantric orgies, and backbreaking, all just madness, absolute madness. So in a way, it's like we're almost seeing that again, not obviously to that extent, but you have to think about, again, like we've spoken about, it doesn't have to always be the extent of calling, swamis parasites, but it can really even be just this kind of backlash of yoga can leave you insane. Even seeing that today was really, really interesting. The parallels, the language might have changed, but the stances are still exactly the same.
yes, I found the yoga ban in Alabama quite like, I don't know. I really don't. What I take away somehow on all of these conversations that we're having is like, of course, like there is conservative Christianity. This is like the group of people that are voicing against this kind of like orders, religious orders, so to speak. But what is it's like, I would like to find out, and I think I don't know, in the U.S. South, it's kind of like a paradigmatic case of this, how these religious sensitivities become in the first place. Like how they become like embodied or somehow like wholly are generating within the people. Because I can imagine that okay, so if you're a conservative Christian, or I mean, no, of course you're not going to say you're a conservative Christian, but somehow your religious sensitivities are geared towards that. And whenever you are faced with some kind of any other religious practice or something that it really doesn't go along with what you have learned or what you have really deeply entrenched in your convictions and values, then it generates that response. So I really don't know what's the history behind this or how did this happens. I have some ideas. Maybe it has to do something with ritual, or maybe it has to do something with like widespread ideas that are like permeating culture constantly. But certainly it leaves me wondering, because I mean yoga as a like a system or set of techniques is ultimately atheistic in the first place, systematized by Patanjali. I don't know, I can't remember how long ago. But the whole purpose was just to reach a kind of altered state of consciousness. And it didn't have like a theological system behind. It can be attached to a theological system, but it's not necessary condition. So the whole point is just to achieve like a altered state of consciousness. And for this set of techniques, there is like specific positions. And what we know, or what has been like kind of widespread as a practice, a wellness practice, or well-being practice, or fitness practice, is the asanas or positions. That's the only thing that has, of course, benefits and concentration and relaxation and stuff. But it doesn't. It's like it's just that it's not even going further, like to attain any kind of knowledge or going communicating with another kind of reality. No, it's just like okay, postures to fix some things here and there. So this is like something that really gets me thinking. I mean, if you would know that this is just the purpose of this set of positional techniques of the body, then you will know it's not so harmful as it might be at first glance or impression. I don't know. I have that idea.
One thing that came up for me when I was reading it, it actually I flashed back to an interview I did 4 years ago for this podcast, for the Religious Studies Project. I talked to Candy Gunther Brown, who had written about ways Christians are appropriating yoga, how you might be an evangelical Christian, very conservative, but also go to a Reiki practitioner and go to yoga. And so we did the interview, and then a very thoughtful critique of the interview was written by Philip. I've never actually met him, so I don't know if it's Delip or Deslip. I'm sorry, Philip. But in the response, Philip talked about how he thought that Gunther Brown, and by extension me, used a too simplistic description of religion when we were talking about yoga. You know, either yoga is religious or it isn't. And he was arguing that we have to take a much broader, like Sidney's saying, a much more formalistic, functionalist understanding. You know, there are Jains, there are Muslims, Hindus who practice yoga. So it's not just one religion that has produced it. And then again, what's the end point? Different people can do it in different ways or with no religious endpoint in mind, and they're doing it purely for the exercise or, you know, as Sidney pointed out, to get to sort of a diffuse state of mind. Well, positive psychology is all about doing that. So it's interesting how I can look back on that interview and how, on the one hand, I felt that Dr. Gunther Brown was spot on talking about the problems of appropriation and these blurry categories, but then also how Philip could point out that both of us were missing this issue of yoga is more than just is or is not religious. Well, it can come from religion and not be religious. It can be all of these different roles in society. And actually, I will say that was one of the more educational moments I had preparing for my my PhD exam in American religion.
I love what you were talking about there, and it makes me think of the lawman who actually started this not movement, but the thing in Alabama is, you know, he talks about in the article how he's practiced yoga for 10 years, and yet he remains a committed Christian and worships in a Baptist church. And I think that that's really interesting as well, because it doesn't have to be so black and white. But when you move from the position of, okay, yoga is a series of poses, the psychological, the physical benefits, to moralizing, I think that's when things get a little bit dangerous, I suppose, because you, again, like we were talking about with the black metal, it's that process of othering. You know, it's like, well, I'm right, but these people are wrong because what they're doing, you know, so the whole all the values of the practice get completely dismissed. And it is the same as that, satanic panic as well. Like yoga is a gateway to, poisoning children to becoming Hindus. Like that kind of language that they were using in the article really shows that there does seem to be sort of this paradigm of fear that people are operating under with respect to things that don't match on paper, tick the boxes of this is what I believe, things that look a little bit different and therefore challenge me. Most people will, people are lazy cognitively. And so cognitively, we'd rather just go, they're wrong, than think anything about sort of nuance and things like that. And, I hate to say it, but thinking about the current condition that we're living in, I do think that, identity and fear is a little bit higher up. So I'm not surprised that in the articles we're seeing backlash to this, backlash to that, because when our sort of mortality salience is so prevalent, then people cling to things that give them safety, and religion. I'm being very terror management theory here, I realize, but that's a really great thing to cling to that gives you that sort of sense of peace or identity. And anything that threatens that in any way then becomes bad. And I think that's really what we're seeing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also sometimes like within in conservative Christianity, people overlook their own contemplative traditions, or kind of not even contemplative, but kind of possible set of techniques that could allow for this kind of strong experience, or this more direct experiences, such as if you go to a Pentecostal church and you see the moment where the glossolalia happens. I mean, it's like these people that attend don't need any kind of preparation, not any particular posture, just the disposition and the collective effervescence that happens in those instances, and they just feel really that there is this very strong experience of communicating with God. I mean, Tanya Lorman's work on different Christian communities is one of very patent evidence of that. I mean, you don't have to go that far from their own traditions, and I think, but again, I think that what is interesting to ask and to afterwards also to problematize and to look for a solution is how these sensitivities become in the first place. So I think that will be I don't know if there are many works. I mean, I'm familiarized with probably anthropology, sociology, or history, maybe some works on the go, but at the same time, I think if one can address this fact, then this other kind of alterization or otherness of other religious or kind of artistic expressions can be understood even better. So I think this is quite an interesting exercise, this perception of alterity and how
culture is such an important aspect of that as well. And the reason why that comes up, Sidney, is what you were talking about of praying in tongues. So I'm from South Africa, and growing up, sort of evangelical Christianity there, I always describe it as, really happy clappy churches with a tiny little drizzle of voodoo over it, because there's a big emphasis on, the tokoloshi and, spirits. And actually South African Christianity is really quite interesting because it is so open to sort of the spiritual realm and things like that. So I came to Glasgow to study, and even speaking to people here, it's like, I'm speaking to colleagues and folk who are interested in religion. I'll talk to them about praying in tongues and things like you would have seen in churches in South Africa. And it's like, oh, no. We don't do that here. No. That's way too pagan.
Even though it looks exactly the same.
Yeah, totally. It's really, really interesting. So it's like the cultural line is so, whereas funny enough, in I don't speak for all South Africans, but in South Africa, so many churches would grow up with that aversion to things like yoga or something like that. So even in cultural settings where the lines are quite blurred and are maybe a little bit more, out there than you would maybe see here in the UK, there is still that aversion. So it's interesting, exactly like you said, where are those lines drawn exactly? And how do we determine that? Who kind of creates that,
Right.
For our last article, I'm impressed we have gone this far without using the word COVID. Maxine, I applaud you for referring to this way we're living instead of saying.
I went a roundabout way.
But this article also deals with some idea of Christian resistance to LGBT issues, to cultural change. So the last article is an op-ed piece by Marianne Duddy Burke. Marianne Duddy Burke is the head of Dignity USA, the largest LGBTQI Catholic group in the United States. And in the article, she discusses how the Catholic Church is allowing its Catholics to get the COVID vaccines, even though they were developed partially from stem cells taken from aborted fetuses. The church is arguing that for the sake of the greater good and stopping the pandemic, and since there are no vaccines available that weren't made from aborted stem cells, go ahead and get the vaccine because we have to end the pandemic. Duddy Burke points out that at the same time, the Catholic Church isn't compromising on not sanctioning condom use to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS, and also not allowing Catholic healthcare facilities to practice gender-affirming care for trans and non-binary patients. Duddy Burke, I think, makes a persuasive argument saying if you're going to argue about religious harm reduction, if you're going to say it's all right to sidestep abortion rulings to get the COVID vaccine, then why can't you bend the rules against birth control to prevent the spread of AIDS? Why can't you practice gender-affirming healthcare to prevent rates of depression, suicide, homelessness, family displacement for trans and LGBT people?
Yeah, this was really an interesting read. And as you say, I agree. I think the author makes such a logical and such a clear argument. And it was actually, to be honest, I felt quite sad when I read this as well because of the strength of her argument. And, the central question, exactly as you said, like, why should preserving lives and the common good be the highest virtues only for COVID? And it is just so powerful, the points that she makes. And I think those are my thoughts on it. Just, it was disheartening to read this, I think.
Yes, I have to agree with you, but I don't know, like if I'm able to quote this phrase. I mean, it says so much in so little. To quote from the article, it's morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in the research and production process. So I think one could write a thesis about it, or like at least an article, because there's so much information in so little. In the sense that, okay, so I don't know, it's like picking up from some readings on sociology of religion, maybe it's like religious institutions as they would like to appeal to any other kind of, we would call authority or transcendental values. As much as they would like to do that, and they do, they have necessarily to play by the rules of any other earthly institution. I mean, and that involves like negotiation, that involves managing resources, that involves bureaucracy in some way. So it is like, yes, of course. I mean, you cannot really have like, if you don't have anyone to preach upon, well, why would it matter to have the institution in the first place? No? If people die so much that you don't have any flock, then why would you be continuing preaching? So it is just like, it shows how actually flexible religious institutions are, despite appearances of what they could at first glance appear like very conservative or straight. No, I mean, they like, it's like any other kind of social institution. They have to negotiate, they have to like assert themselves in a specific given time and place in history and culture. And I think this is no different. So, or also thinking in the sense that, just of course, you have this kind of moral obligations or like values that you affirm, but it somehow seems that the more the basic, like the basic livelihood of people is affected, I mean, you have to give somehow condone some of, or like give them some of them away. So okay, we can experiment with vaccine brought from stem cell research, but at least we have someone to preach upon that way. But the other things, no, we don't we don't negotiate with that. I wonder what would need to happen for this like a possibility to be like as
well,
an option.
in some regards, I think if the Catholic Church wants to bend the letter of the law whilst not changing doctrine, allowing condom use is going to be easier for conservative Catholics because you know, AIDS affects everyone regardless of sexual orientation, and so they can say, well, if these are, I could see the Catholic Church arguing that it's okay for straight couples to use condoms when they're worried about it. But the bigger sticking point is when we're talking about sex between members of the same gender or between people who identify as LGBT. Same goes for offering trans-affirming care. That would require the Catholic Church to actually say that it is not disordered to be a trans person, which would require a much more fundamental shift on what the Church teaches about sexuality and gender, which are two different things that the Catholic Church tends to treat as synonymous.
Exactly.
But I don't know what it would take to move the Vatican.
No, too much power plays in place. It's a lot. It's a lot of things to think. Yeah, but I think considering this context that we are living in, it just shows how somehow like religious institution can be flexible if they want to, and if the conditions are make it necessarily to be flexible. So we just need to keep on pushing for these other rights and like having like the conversation, as I said, but also having action to back that conversation up.
It actually goes back to the image of Montero saying, call me. He's saying, call me by your name. He's almost like saying, I want you to say my name and recognize me as a person. Now, the question is, can conservative Christians who are frightened by change, can they do that?
That's the big question.
It's not all bad. I was just trying to remember the article that I'm busy reading at the moment, and I don't have it with me, but maybe we can link it in the description, about gay and lesbian affirming churches, and we do see that a lot in Christianity of churches that, do openly accept folk who are LGBTQ, and I think that is something that is definitely positive, and so it's, I guess, exactly as you were saying, Sidney, is that there is some flexibility, definitely not enough, but at least there are some sort of movements into greater sort of openness and acceptance, and that was a really brilliant article. I wish I could remember the names, that I'm only halfway through, but it was really interesting to see how individuals who are LGBTQ can actually sort of no longer compartmentalize these two identities, being gay and being Christian, but can actually integrate them and get a lot more sort of like spiritual and psychological freedom and equilibrium in that, which I think was really interesting. So I will send the link to it, this article.
Well, and I think as I'm mindful of the time here, as we move to the end of the program, a through line does seem to be in all these cases is that Christianity is not monolithic. You have Christians who practice yoga, whether or not they find religious benefit in it and find it acceptable. You have Catholics who are, well, first of all, Catholics who are queer and affirm their place in the church. You also have Catholics who are not queer and affirm their place in the church. This is true, I'm sure, of some more liberal evangelicals, even though in the United States, the conservative ones kind of suck up all the media oxygen. And certainly in Poland, as Sidney pointed out, very few young Poles go to church regularly. Now, I think the big question is, do we assume, we can't assume that people who aren't religiously observant, that doesn't mean they're going to be liberal on cultural issues. I think that's I think we need to get better at parsing. If you're not taking a liberal stance on religion, like Marianne Duddy Burke is doing, she's a Catholic and she's the head of an LGBT Catholic organization. If you're saying, I'm just not going to worship at all, I'm going to be secular, I don't know. I mean, what do we see happening more? Are people who dissatisfied with conservatism going to walk away from religion entirely or take it in a liberal direction? I'm not sure.
Indeed. Oh, just to make a precision, there is even within black metal, there is black metal. So it's like people that are Christian and they play with black metal aesthetics and sounds. So even there is like this kind of
Yeah.
flexibility, nuances, and possibilities in
I
any
love
case.
that.
So you can see it in art, you can see it everywhere. Yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine a praise band being like, "Love the Lord."
Running around forests.
Exactly, like angry pandas.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the first and last time you'll ever attempt me here to sing death metal. Maxine, Sidney, thank you both for your time. And everyone, go watch Montero's video.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR, and the IAHR, and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's the other guy. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Lauren Osborne, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, podcast transcription by Andy Alexander and Savannah Finver, and social media managed by Ray Radford and Candice Mixon.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our Amazon affiliate links or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.